March 28th, 1757. Dawn breaks over Paris like a wound. The Place de Grève fills with shadows and anticipation. 16 executioners prepare their instruments, pincers glowing red, cauldrons of oil bubbling, horses pouring at the cobblestones. In the Conciergerie prison, a man sits in the same cell where Ravaillac waited for death 147 years before. Robert-François Damiens looks at his hands one last time. La journée sera rude, he whispers to the darkness. The day will be hard. But the real story begins on a cold January evening at Versailles. The torches cast dancing shadows on the palace walls. Louis XV, the well-beloved, moves through the corridors with his entourage. 6 o'clock approaches. The king's carriage waits in the covered passageway. A figure emerges from the hollow near the archway, a penknife hidden in his sleeve. This man has been waiting, watching, carrying the weight of a decision that will transform him from nobody into eternal infamy. The king steps toward his carriage. Damiens pushes through the guards, his hat still on his head, a detail that will save the king's life. He grabs Louis's shoulder with one hand, with the other he strikes. The blade penetrates barely a centimetre through the thick winter clothes. Louis thinks he's been punched, then sees his hand covered in blood. "I am wounded," he says with the calmness of royalty. Damiens makes no attempt to flee. He stands there, knife in hand, waiting to be seized. The guards descend upon him. They notice his hat. No commoner keeps his hat on before the king. This breach of protocol marks him as the assassin. As they drag him away, Damiens seems almost peaceful. He has done what he came to do, not to kill, he will later insist, but to touch the king, to wake him from his slumber of indifference. But the machinery of royal justice has already begun to turn, and it turns toward horror. Who was this man who dared to spill royal blood? Robert-François Damiens was born on January 9th, 1715, in La Tuileries, a forgotten hamlet near Arras. The eighth of 10 children, his father, Pierre-Joseph, was a day labourer who sometimes worked as an executioner, a detail that drips with dark prophecy. Poverty wrapped around the family like a shroud. When Damiens was not yet 15, his mother Marie died in childbirth, leaving 6 surviving children scattered like seeds in a bitter wind. Young Robert was sent to his great-uncle in Bethune, a grain merchant and tavern keeper who tried to educate the boy. But Damiens resisted learning, resisted apprenticeship, resisted everything. They called him untoward and perverse from infancy. At 16, he fled to become a soldier, costing his uncle 400 livres. The army gave him structure but no purpose. After discharge, he drifted into domestic service, that shadow world where servants hear everything and remain invisible. He worked at the Jesuit College of Louis le Grand in Paris, absorbing fragments of theology and philosophy like a sponge absorbs poison. Dismissed for theft, he found employment with parliamentary councillors, standing silent in corners while they raged against the king. Dismissed again for misconduct. They began calling him Robert le Diable, Robert the Devil, a name he seemed to embrace, or perhaps it embraced him. The transformation was gradual, then sudden. Working for magistrates of the Parlement, Damiens listened to endless denunciations of Louis XV. The Jansenist crisis consumed Paris. Priests refusing sacraments, Parliament defying the crown, the kingdom splitting like rotten wood. Damiens absorbed it all. The religious fervour, the political rage, the talk of tyranny and divine justice. In the antechambers of power, waiting on his masters, he began conducting mock trials of the archbishop in his mind. By 1756, Damiens had become something else. No longer just a failed servant, but a man with a mission crystallising in his fevered brain. He stole from a Russian merchant, fled to Artois where his family lived in destitution. The price of bread had soared. People starved while the king hunted at Versailles. His wife Elizabeth begged him to leave Paris, sensing the darkness gathering around him. He promised to go to Artois. Instead, he went to Versailles. January 3rd, 1757, 3 in the morning, Damiens arrives at Versailles, asks directions to an inn. He drinks wine, waits. 2 days of watching, walking the palace grounds, studying the king's movements. There is no dispatching of business at this cursed Versailles, he mutters. The religious wound of France festers in his mind. The Jansenists denied sacraments, the people denied bread, and at the centre of it all, the king who could fix everything with a word but chooses silence. January 5th, 4 o'clock. The winter sun already fading. Damiens positions himself in the hollow by the stairs. The knife weighs almost nothing. He's not even sure he'll use it. Perhaps just to show it, to make the king understand. But then Louis appears, surrounded by courtiers like a sun surrounded by moths. The Dauphin, future Louis XVI, walks beside him. Damiens feels destiny pulling him forward. The moment of contact. Damien grabs the king, feels the royal flesh beneath the cloth, drives the blade home. Such a small wound for such enormous consequences. "What have you done?" someone shouts. "I have done what I came to do," Damiens replies. No struggle, no attempt to escape. He seems surprised when they begin beating him, as if violence was never part of his plan. The interrogation begins immediately. They want names, conspirators, the web of treason. But Damien speaks only in riddles and religious ecstasy. Religion drove him to it, he says. The sacrament should not be refused. The people suffer. The king must restore order. Under torture, the boots crushing his legs, the brodequins breaking bones. He gives random names, then recounts. They torture him again. He speaks of voices, of divine missions, of saving France. The trial is a foregone conclusion. The Parlement that once defied the king now scrambles to prove its loyalty through severity. They reach back to 1610, to Ravaillac's execution for killing Henri IV. But Ravaillac succeeded in regicide. Damiens merely scratched the royal skin. No matter. The sentence is the same. To be drawn and quartered, but first, tortured with a creativity that would make hell itself take notes. March the 26th, 1757. The sentence is read. Damiens listens with what witnesses describe as unnatural calm. He will have his right hand burnt with sulphur. Red-hot pincers will tear his flesh. Boiling oil, melted lead, and wax will be poured into his wounds. 4 horses will tear him apart. His ashes will be scattered. His house demolished. His family banished. Even his name must die. It's not just execution, it's erasure. 2 days to contemplate what's coming. In his cell, Damiens oscillates between religious mania and terrible clarity. He asks for a confessor, is refused, asks for mercy, is laughed at. The guards report he barely sleeps, muttering about salvation and sacrifice. On the morning of March 28th, they come for him. The day will be hard, he says, almost conversationally. The understatement of the century. The Place de Grève has become an amphitheatre of horror. Thousands pack the square, climb on roofs, lean from windows. Ladies of the court have paid fortunes for balcony seats. They bring opera glasses to better see the blood. Giacomo Casanova is there, having arrived in Paris by coincidence. Later he will write that the ladies wagered on how far the blood would spurt, their fans fluttering with excitement. Charles-Henri Sanson, the royal executioner, supervises the preparation. The same Sanson who will, 36 years later, execute Louis XVI, the boy who watched his grandfather's would-be assassin die. History loves its ironies. Sanson has 16 assistants today. The magnitude of the sentence requires it. The scaffold is built high so everyone can see. The instruments are displayed, the pincers, the ladles, the brands. The horses wait, sensing the crowd's bloodlust. They strip Damiens naked. The first torture. The hand that held the knife is burnt with sulphur. His screams echo across the square. Some in the crowd cheer, others turn away. The sulphur creates a blue flame that seems almost beautiful until you remember it's consuming human flesh. Damiens cries out to God, to the Virgin, to anyone who might listen. No one does. Next, the pincers. Red-hot metal tears chunks from his arms, thighs, chest. Each wound is a new symphony of agony. The executioners work methodically, professionally. This is not passion but process. Into each wound they pour their terrible cocktail. Boiling oil that sizzles, molten lead that hardens in the flesh, wax that seals the screaming wounds only to be torn open again. Through it all, Damiens remains conscious. Witnesses report he looks at himself, at what they're doing to his body with a kind of horrified fascination. Between screams, he begs for forgiveness, not from the king, but from God. "Pardon, Lord, pardon!" The crowd grows restless. This is taking too long. They came for swift justice, not this prolonged butchery. Now comes the main event. Ropes are tied to his 4 limbs, attached to 4 horses. The signal is given. The horses pull. But the human body, even torn and burnt, resists dismemberment. The joints hold. The crowd murmurs disappointment. Damien's screams have become something else. Not quite human anymore, but not yet dead. The horses strain. The ropes creak. Nothing separates. An hour passes. The horses are exhausted, foam at their mouths. The crowd grows angry. They want their climax. Sanson conferences with the authorities. A decision is made. They will cut the tendons and sinews, help the horses along. The executioner approaches with his blade. Damiens, impossibly, is still conscious. He watches the knife approach his shoulders, his hips. He tries to speak, but only blood comes out. The cutting takes time. Tendons are tough, resistant. Each slice brings new screams that don't sound human anymore. Finally, the right arm tears free. The crowd roars approval, then the left arm. Damien's head lolls, but his eyes remain open, watching. The legs prove more difficult. They add 2 more horses. 6 beasts now pull at what remains of Robert-François Damiens. The right leg separates with a sound witnesses describe as wet wood breaking. Then the left. What remains is a torso, somehow still alive, still breathing through destroyed lungs. The confessor approaches, puts his ear to the lipless mouth. Later he claims Damiens was still trying to speak, to pray. Others say it was just air escaping from punctured organs. They carry the torso to the stake. The fire has been burning for hours, waiting. As they throw him in, some swear they see his eyes move one last time. The crowd cheers, applauds. Ladies return to their carriages, discussing the spectacle over champagne. Children are held up to see the flames. This is education in the price of touching the sacred body of the king. The burning takes hours more. Every piece must be consumed, reduced to ash. Nothing of Damiens must remain. As night falls, they gather the ashes in baskets, ride to the Seine, scatter them on the wind. His house in La Thieuloise is demolished stone by stone. His father, wife, and 17-year-old daughter are banished from France. His brothers and sisters forced to change their names. The erasure is complete. Or is it? Because we still speak his name. Damiens, the last man executed by drawing and quartering in France. The execution was meant to reinforce royal power, but instead it revealed its barbarity. Voltaire wrote about it with disgust. Casanova couldn't forget the ladies betting on blood. 7 years later, Cesare Beccaria would cite Damiens in his treatise against torture and capital punishment. What drove Damiens to his penknife? Madness, certainly. But a madness born from the contradictions of his time. A servant who heard too much, understood too little, felt too deeply. He lived in the shadows of power, absorbing the rage of his masters, the suffering of his class, the religious fever of his age. It all crystallized into a moment of violence that solved nothing but revealed everything. Louis XV survived, ruled another 17 years, died in his bed. The monarchy limped on until revolution swept it away. The grandson who watched Damiens' arrest would himself face Sanson's son on another scaffold. The wheel of fortune turns, and those who tie men to horses sometimes find themselves tied to history's judgment. Some call Damiens a martyr, others a madman. The truth sits somewhere between, in that space where desperation meets delusion. He wanted to touch the king, to make him feel what France felt. Instead, he became a spectacle of suffering that touched no one's heart, changed no one's mind. The system that created him simply consumed him and moved on. 40 years later, they would remember Damiens when Robespierre, another man from Arras, brought his own vision of justice to France. Enemies called Robespierre Damiens' nephew, though they shared no blood. They shared only a birthplace and a belief that violence could wake France from its slumber. Both were wrong. France wasn't sleeping, it was waiting. In the end, what was Damiens? A failed servant who stole from his masters, a failed assassin who barely drew blood, a failed prophet whose message drowned in his own screams. But perhaps failure itself was the message. The spectacular failure of a system where a scratch on the royal skin warranted 6 hours of torture, where poverty drove men mad, where God and king had become so confused that murder seemed like prayer. The Place de Grève is now the Place de l'Hôtel de Ville. Tourists take photos where Damiens was torn apart. No plaque marks the spot. History has its embarrassments. But on cold March mornings, when the sun rises like a wound over Paris, some say you can still hear it, not screams but whispers. La journée sera rude, the day will be hard. Every day since has proven him right. They say Damien's hair turned white during the torture, from brown to snow in 6 hours. The body's testimony to what the mind couldn't process. But this might be legend like so much else. The crowd needed him to be superhuman in his suffering, needed the spectacle to mean something more than mere sadism. So they gave him white hair, last words, a dignity he was denied in life. The executioners were paid triple wages. The horses were sold to farmers who swore they were cursed. Crops failed wherever they ploughed. Sanson never spoke of it, but his son claimed the father had nightmares until death. Even professional killers have limits. Or perhaps it was the crowd that haunted him. Their joy, their appetite, their transformation into something worse than any single madman with a penknife. Does history judge the criminals or the darkness that created them? Damien's was both criminal and victim, assassin and sacrifice. The darkness was France itself, a kingdom sick with inequality, drunk on divine right, stumbling toward revolution. Damien's was merely the fever that announced the disease. They broke him on the wheel, but the wheel was already breaking. Today we call it the Age of Enlightenment, but it was also the age of drawing and quartering. Voltaire wrote philosophy while Damien screamed in the square. The encyclopedia was published while men were torn apart by horses. Progress and barbarism walked hand in hand like king and assassin approaching the carriage. Which one carried the knife? Which one deserved the scaffold? History still deliberates. The last word belongs to Damien's, if he spoke it. O death, why art thou so long in coming? 6 hours he waited for death while Paris watched. 6 hours of proving that civilization is 3 missed meals from barbarism, that justice and vengeance wear the same robes, that the sacred body of the king bleeds the same red as the profane body of the servant. On March 28, 1757, France tore a man apart to prove its power. Instead, it proved its fear. Every scream from Damien was a prophecy of the revolution to come. Every drop of blood a promise that divine right would drown in its own excess. The horses pulled him apart, but they were really pulling apart the ancien regime. It just took a few more decades for the body to realise it was dead. But what does this spectacle mean beyond its horror? The philosopher Michel Foucault would later open his famous work with Damien, using his broken body as a doorway into understanding power itself. This wasn't just punishment, it was theatre of sovereignty. The king's body had been touched, so Damien's body must be destroyed in the most elaborate way possible. Every scream was meant to repair the cosmic wound of attempted regicide. The sovereign's power was written in flesh and fire. Yet something strange happens in this ritual of power. The crowd that was meant to cower instead becomes excited, aroused, complicit. The ladies with their opera glasses aren't learning to fear the king, they're being entertained. Some in the crowd begin to admire Damien's endurance, his refusal to die quickly. Heroes are being made in the very spectacle meant to destroy them. Power reveals its weakness precisely when it tries to demonstrate its strength. 80 years after Damien screamed in the Place de Grève, a new kind of punishment emerges. No more spectacles, no more scaffolds. Instead, timetables, regulations, silent cells. 7 o'clock wake, 8 o'clock work, prescribed movements, regulated breathing. The prison replaces the scaffold. The soul replaces the body as the target. This is progress, they say, more humane, more civilized. But Foucault sees something else. Not less cruelty, but more efficient cruelty. Not the end of torture, but its perfection. The modern prison doesn't destroy the body in 6 hours. It shapes it over 6 years, 60 years. Every moment scheduled, every gesture prescribed. The prisoner becomes a machine programmed by routine. This is what Foucault calls the docile body, not broken by horses, but moulded by discipline. Schools, factories, armies, hospitals, they all use the same techniques. Stand here, sit there, move like this, think like that. The scaffold was spectacular but inefficient. Discipline is invisible but total. Consider Bentham's panopticon, that perfect prison where every cell can be watched from a central tower. But prisoners never know if they're being observed. The possibility of surveillance becomes constant reality in the prisoner's mind. He becomes his own guard, his own torturer. No need for chains when the prisoner chains himself. This is power perfected. Not the king's revenge on Damien's body, but society's colonization of every soul. The shift from Damien's to the modern prisoner isn't humanitarian progress. It's power becoming smarter, subtler, more pervasive. The public execution sometimes created martyrs, sparked riots, questioned authority. The ladies wagering on blood spatter might start wondering why the king deserved such power. But the modern prison hides everything. No crowds, no spectacle, no dangerous moments of potential rebellion. Just quiet, efficient, invisible control. From torture to timetable, from scaffold to cell, from body to soul. This is what Foucault calls the political technology of the body. Power no longer needs to tear you apart with horses. It just needs to know you, classify you, normalize you. Are you normal or abnormal? Sane or insane? Productive or deviant? The executioner is replaced by the psychiatrist, the torturer by the teacher, the scaffold by the examination room. Damiens was judged for one act, attempting to kill the king. The modern prisoner is judged for his entire being, his thoughts, his desires, his potential for reform. The question is no longer, what did you do, but who are you? And more terrifyingly, who can we make you become? The machinery that destroyed Damiens in 6 hours now works on all of us every day, so quietly we don't even notice the horses pulling. In schools, children learn to sit still, raise hands, move in lines, 2 fingers between body and table, elbow positioned just so. In factories, workers submit to the rhythm of machines, their bodies becoming extensions of mechanical processes. In hospitals, patients surrender their bodies to medical schedules, examinations, classifications. What began as punishment for criminals becomes training for citizens. We are all Damiens now, but our torture is called education, employment, healthcare. The sovereign who ordered Damiens' destruction claimed power from God, divine right to rule, to punish, to destroy. But modern power claims authority from science, from knowledge, from expertise. Psychiatrists decide who is sane, educators determine who is intelligent, doctors declare who is healthy. This new priesthood doesn't serve a king but something more abstract and therefore more powerful. The norm, the average, the standard against which all deviation is measured and corrected. What would Damiens make of our world? No more public squares filled with screaming crowds, but cameras on every corner, algorithms tracking every click, profiles building with every purchase. The panopticon perfected beyond Bentham's dreams. We carry our cells in our pockets, update our own files, surveil ourselves and each other. The spectacle of punishment is replaced by the spectacle of conformity. Instead of gathering to watch a man torn apart, we gather online to tear apart anyone who deviates from the norm. The genius of modern power is that it makes us complicit in our own discipline. Damiens had to be dragged to the scaffold, but we walk willingly into our cells, schools, offices, hospitals, and thank power for the opportunity. We internalize the timetable, embrace the examination, celebrate our normalization. The horses that pulled Damiens apart were external. Our horses are internal, and we've learned to call them by prettier names: ambition, responsibility, self-improvement. This is why Damiens haunts modernity. Not because his execution was barbaric, though it was. Not because it was unjust, though it was. But because in his spectacular destruction, we can see clearly what power wants to hide: its violence, its arbitrariness, its fundamental cruelty. The modern prison pretends to reform while it destroys. The scaffold at least was honest about its intentions. From 1757 to today, from Damiens to databases, from the scaffold to the spreadsheet, power evolves but never disappears. It simply becomes better at hiding, better at making us accomplish its work ourselves. The crowd that watched Damiens die could at least see what power was doing. We can barely perceive our own imprisonment, so perfectly have we internalized ourselves, so completely have we become our own guards. The Jansenist crisis that drove Damiens to his penknife has been replaced by other crises: economic, ecological, existential. But the structure remains. Power creates the very problems it claims to solve, then uses those problems to justify its expansion. Damiens thought he could wake the king to France's suffering. He didn't understand that the suffering was not a failure of the system, but its product. The bread shortages, the religious conflicts, the poverty, all necessary for power to position itself as salvation. In the end, what separates us from the crowd at the Place de Grève? They watched power destroy a man's body and called it justice. We watch power shape souls and call it progress. They had the honesty to face what they were doing, Gathered in the square, blood on their shoes, screams in their ears. We hide behind institutions, behind expertise, behind the belief that our violence is actually kindness, our cruelty actually care. So we map this execution not as distant barbarity, but as mirror, as prophecy, as warning. Every society has its Damiens, the desperate, deluded souls who think violence can wake the powerful. Every society has its Place de Grève, the stage where power performs its terrible theatre. But now the stage is everywhere and nowhere. The theatre never ends, and we are all both audience and actor, guard and prisoner, sovereign and subject. The only question that remains, the question Foucault forces us to confront. Once we see the horses, the ones that pull Damiens apart, the ones that pull us apart daily in slower, subtler ways, what do we do? Do we pretend they aren't there? Do we learn to love our harnesses? Or do we begin, finally, to imagine a world without scaffolds, without cells, without the machinery of normalization that makes us all accomplices in our own discipline? Perhaps that's why they had to scatter Damien's ashes on the wind, not to erase him, but because even power knew that some things once seen cannot be unseen. Some screams once heard echo forever. Some questions once asked demand answers. The day was hard for Damiens, but the days since have been harder for those who must live with what his destruction revealed. That all power is violence, all civilization is barbarism with better manners, and all progress is just finding quieter ways to tear the human soul apart. On March 28, 1757, France showed its true face in the Place de Grève. Every March 28th since, we wake to the same truth Damiens discovered. The day will be hard. The only difference is we've learned to call our torture by other names, learned to love our chains, learned to be grateful for the privilege of being slowly, systematically, scientifically destroyed. Damiens lasted 6 hours. We last a lifetime. Which execution is more cruel? Which crowd more complicit? Which power more total? Perhaps these are the questions that make tyrants scatter ashes, hoping the wind will carry away not just bones, but the unbearable truth of what we do to each other and call it civilization.